All right, welcome, governors. Welcome back to Power Squared. Today, we've got a video on environment variables for you. Now, environment variables, you might know what they are, or you might be thinking, well, what does that actually mean? So, Josh, what are environment variables?
An environment variable is effectively a reusable kind of configuration setting in Power Platform where you can store a value which you can then reference within your solutions. What this means is you don't need to hard code values in your apps or your flows, which when we start to talk about application lifecycle management, which we'll be doing in a future video, when we start bringing these solutions through to test and production environments, rather than having to scramble and change a value every single time, we just change the environment variable, and anywhere where that's referenced will update and it automatically work. So that's what an environment variable is. We've got some demos to show you in this episode. So hopefully we can kind of really showcase how these work and why you should be using them within your solutions when you're developing. This isn't something that's just for the kind of pro coders out there. You know, if you're a maker, if you're just starting out and not really sure, this video is definitely for you. So yeah, do stay tuned whilst we kind of walk you through this. So Charles, you're in the hot seat today, driving the demo for us. Do you want to kind of walk us through what we've got here?
Absolutely. So, first things first, you might have created your Canvas app already, and it might not be in a solution. But what we're looking at is where we're wanting to move everything using solutions. So, the first thing you want to do is make sure your app is inside of a solution. So, we've got a solution that we've created here. It's called Power Squared, and you can see you've got an overview of the solution, you've got the objects in the solution, and so on and so forth. Don't need to worry about the other bits for now. So, inside of this solution, we've got multiple components, and we've just narrowed it down to the app at the moment. So if your app is not yet in a solution, create a solution and then go to add existing app, Canvas app, find your app and add it to that solution. And do the same if you've got anything that's related to that Canvas app solution. So maybe you've got some Power Automate flows, you'll want to bring them into the same solution with it. So that's your starting point. Now, what should we move on to next, Josh? Should we go into the Canvas app itself?
Let's go into the app and showcase maybe a typical scenario or starting point of, I think, where most people will kind of start when building an app and not really thinking about variables.
Yep. So we have our Canvas app here, and it's quite a straightforward Canvas app. It's the typical kind of app that you would create where you're interacting with data. So if I play the app here, you can see we've got a menu on the left-hand side. We have a table here where we've got data that's coming from a SharePoint list. So we've got, this is a dev item, governor test, because we love governors. And at the bottom here, where I'm actually accidentally hiding it, is a send the email button. So if I just make sure that the minimum height, so this is Microsoft putting in some nice code there, I make sure the minimum height isn't too big, then we've got the option to send the email. So first things first, let's have a look at where is this data actually coming from. So I have another tab open here where we've got our Power Squared SharePoint site, and we have a list in there called Power Squared Dev. So this is our development list, and we've got our items here. So if you're working without environment variables, then maybe you would just have your one list at the moment, and you're developing in the same place as sharing your data, which is very risky because you might make a mistake, introduce a bug, and corrupt your data, or even worse than that, you might accidentally delete everything. So we don't want to do that. We want to have two separate lists. So in order to have two separate lists through SharePoint, we can do things like copy an existing list, and then that makes it nice and easy, can't we? But how do we actually interact with that list in the app?
Just bringing that up, Charles, I just wanted to chime in with some questions for you. So we've kind of just said there that we want to have different lists for our kind of scenarios, but why? If I'm using SharePoint, maybe just starting to use Canvas apps or Power apps, it feels over the top for what I'm doing. Maybe I'm just doing something that's being shared through the team, or there's no real risk of this data, but there is risks, isn't there? Do you want to just talk a little bit more about that and why we should be considering separate lists for our kind of app development?
Yeah, I guess the very first thing to mention is that we want clean data. And if we're working on this app at the moment, we'll probably want to create some test records to make sure that our creation method is working nicely. So as we're doing that, we're then creating these test records that are in our production list. They're available to our end users. So then what at the end of our development session would then have to delete them, I guess, or are they just going to stay there and it remains messy? Let's say that we want to edit something. Maybe our code isn't quite right and we meant to say just edit one, but by mistake, we're actually editing every item in the list. Well, then by mistake, we've suddenly updated all of the items in the list and our data's gone, unless we can restore it. And a similar thing when we're deleting it, we might be deleting something using a condition, and maybe the condition is too expansive, so therefore we accidentally delete everything. Yeah, we can go to the recycle bin in SharePoint, but it's still a risky thing to start playing around with that production data. So really, we want to have a completely separate place that we develop where if something does go wrong, it's not going to hurt the current app, the current list. But in addition to that, if we're working on the app that people are currently using, we need to be careful that we don't publish a version that has a bug in it. We want to test our changes first, make sure that we're happy with everything, and then we want to give it to those end users. And it's too easy to make a mistake when you're developing something that then could impact everyone that's using the app. Any other things that I've missed there?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, and from what I'm hearing in a very brief summary, is it's all about risk mitigation and quality assurance at the end of the day, and having these practices in place from the get-go is going to make life a lot easier should problems happen. And they will happen. If they haven't happened to you yet, they will happen. Trust me, it happens to everyone. We've all been there. So it's really good practice to start thinking about this. So yeah, I think that answers the question. So if we go back to our demo, then we've obviously opened it up. We've got our dev list added here. What next?
Well, one thing I think that's important to note is you need to know where this data is coming from. And of course, I've said it's coming from here, but what guarantees do you have that it's really coming from there? So one thing that we can do, if we close that out, we can go to our data on the left. We can see it's SharePoint as our data source. We can click on the ellipsis, 3 dots, and then we can go to edit data, and that will actually open up that SharePoint list that we were looking at. And you can see, yeah, they're identical. So that is the list that we're currently referring to. And that's important because when you're going to this, you want to know that you are actually interacting with the right list. We don't want to click on edit and then to open up the production list and we realize we've made a mistake somewhere. So just double check that it's definitely the right data that you're working with. So another thing that we've done that's a really common use case is you'd be triggering a Power Automate flow from your app. So we've got this send the email button, which is quite a typical scenario where you've got something going on in your app. You'd need to send an email, trigger sending an email. Ideally, you would do that using Power Automate because you don't really want to put too much logic in the app itself. And it's an asynchronous process, so it shouldn't happen at the same time or doesn't need to happen at the same time. So if I just show what's on that button, we're just running a Power Automate flow. Send a Power Squared email. And if I go over to the left here, I can find Power Automate in our app, and we've got our Power Automate flow there, which is sending an email. So if I click on that button, then what we will have is in my inbox here, I receive an email, and this is the email that it sent, and it's telling us that it was sent to my email address. But what we want in production is we don't actually want to send it to the developer. We want to send it to potentially the end user. So really, I don't want this email going to me. Josh, I want this email going to you. So we've got an issue there. So how could we get around the fact that I don't want this email to go to me and dev? I want it to go to you in production.
That's where environment variables kick in again, isn't it? There's far-reaching use cases for environment variables. And I think those two scenarios that we've just spoke about, in my opinion, are two of the most common scenarios that as a maker, you will probably encounter. So common that it's probably something you can start using today. If you're building an app and you're sending an email from the app, you are sending it to a test account 9 times out of 10. But you do not want to do that in production, like Charles mentioned. And when we then deploy this app, changing that email becomes really onerous if you don't use environment variables. So this is why we want to use them, and this is why we need to master them and incorporate them into our kind of developer workflow, really.
So we've looked at the app. Now we should go back to our solution and figure out what's going on with that. So in our solution at the moment, we have our app and we have a flow, which is there, although it says 0. I probably need to refresh the page. But yeah, we have an app and we have a flow. And what we have done is we've already gone ahead and we've added some environment variables. So we've got 3 environment variables, and you might be thinking, well, why have you got 3 when you're talking about a SharePoint list and an email address? Well, there's a reason for that. Josh, do you want to explain these environment variables, what they are?
Yeah, absolutely. And, as you can tell on the screen there, that they're fairly intuitively named. If we run through them and break them down one by one, for clarity's sake, hopefully it'll make more sense. So first up, we've got our email variable. And when we open that up, or when we create it, you can see there, obviously it's giving us a display name. Best practice is to make sure that, represents what you're wanting it to kind of be. So in this case, it's an email address. So that's what we've got there, Power Squared email. It auto creates the name. That's just part of the solution kind of naming schema. You can give it a description, general good practice, and that just helps, again, identify what this is used for, what it's doing. Now, because we've already created this, we don't see all the different data types, but there are lots of different data types that you can choose from. The most common that I find is text and data source. I think you're actually going to showcase that there. So yeah, look, we can choose different ones, right? Decimal numbers, JSON, text, yes, no, data source, and a secret. So these are some really powerful options that we can choose for our data type. For email, the one that best represents an email is a string, so text. We have a default value, which is the value that would always be defaulted to whenever we went into an environment, and there isn't a current value set. So really important distinction there. If you don't have a current value set, the default will always be used. If you have a current value set, which is that one underneath default value, that is the one that is going to be used in your environment. So you can see there, it's set to your email, Charles. And whenever we use this environment variable in an email action, let's say in the address bar to send an email, it's going to send it to that address. And that makes it really powerful. Charles, you want to chip in with anything there?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I did something. I had a considered move. I can't think of the right words for this, but essentially I decided not to include a default value because I could have used the Charles at UK as the default value, but I don't want that to be used in production. So I'm forcing whoever's deploying this into a new environment that they have to provide their own value for it, because I don't want them to send it to my email address because I'm just the developer.
Yeah.
So that's one way that you can force people to provide a value for it. But if you put a default value, of course, they don't have to change it and they might be using that default value, which can be a great thing, but you just need to think, is that what you want to do?
Yeah, really important to know that. If you don't have it set, it's going to prompt on import of your solution. So that's good. So we understand the email variable. Let's look at the SharePoint one. And we're going to start with the SharePoint site, right? Because when we talk about SharePoint, we talk about sites, and then we talk about lists, typically as our data source. The site being the container for our lists. So when we look here, same again, the only differences we've got this time is our display name is obviously slightly different to represent a SharePoint site variable. Our data type now is data source. Now, immediately what that's going to do is that's going to then say, well, what is your data source? And there's a few out of the box that you can choose from. In our case, we've chosen SharePoint, but it does support Dataverse and SQL, which are 2 other really common ones. And I think it supports some others now too. But we've chosen SharePoint in our example. Then it's going to ask for a connection. So what will happen then? We've picked SharePoint as our connector, and then we're going to create a connection. And what that connection is going to do is that's going to return all the available sites and lists that we can choose from. Now, we want to choose a site first because we need to know what site our lists are on. So in this case, we've chosen site, and then it's going to give us a list of sites to choose from. So we've picked our demo site in this case, saved it, and that's it, all set up and ready to go. Now, when we move on to a SharePoint list environment variable, it's the same principle again. Only difference here is rather than choosing our site, because we've already defined that, we now need to pick our list. So we've changed the site down to the parameter type from site to list. We pick our SharePoint site and we've picked our list, which is Power Squared Dev. And that's that list that we've showcased in the app. That's all kind of ready to go. But what we haven't done is told our app that we want to look at this environment variable. At the minute, it's hard coded. So this is where the magic happens. Charles, do you want to walk us through the kind of magic here?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the moment, we've got our data as being a direct connection to that list. So it's not something that can vary depending on the environment. So what we want to do is we want to remove that because that's not really what we want. And then we go back to add data and we add SharePoint just like we added it before. And we choose SharePoint, we choose our connection. But instead of choosing it from our recent sites or putting the URL in at the top here, we go to advanced. And it's in advanced that we can then find our environment variables. And this is our SharePoint site environment variable that we just looked at. So when we click on that, we then get some lists that exist within that site. But don't click on one of those lists because this is the same scenario as with the site. We don't want to choose a list here because then that will be a static value. Instead, we want to go to advanced again, and then we get environment variables for the lists within that specific site. So it's a little bit of jumping that we have to go through in order to get there, but then we get to this SharePoint list, which we can then connect to, and we're connected to the same SharePoint list, but this time we're connected to it via an environment variable. So that means if we change the SharePoint list in the environment variable, then it will change within the app, which is incredibly clever.
As you can see there as well, the data is exactly the same because it's looking at the same thing. So we're not doing anything with that. It's already picked up by default that we're looking at our dev list. So really powerful stuff, but now it's dynamic. So this now means that when we move to our test and production environments, we're going to see some really cool magic. So yeah, it's really interesting stuff.
And as we demoed, you don't have to worry about removing that data source and then re-adding it because the app will understand it's the same name. It's not changing the name. It's just changing the way that you're accessing it, as long as you, of course, choose exactly the same data source via your environment variable. So the other thing that we wanted to change was we've got this sends the email thing. So it runs this Power Automate flow. So we need to go into our Power Automate flow. We'll do that inside of the app. Of course, you could do it from Power Automate, or you could do it from your solution in make.powerapps.com. Multiple ways that you can get to it. But for us, it's nice and easy just to do it from the app here. So we'll go and edit our Power Automate flow, and then it will open it up in the old designer, which it always does in the Power Apps Studio. But we don't really mind for this. It's very simple. So we've got our send an email here, and I've hard-coded in the developer's email address. I've hard-coded in mine. But what we really want to do is we want to be able to say, well, that email address is going to change depending on whether we're working on it in development or whether it's in test or whether it's in a production environment and we're sharing it with users. So we can add dynamic content, and then immediately we can see that we've got environment variables as our dynamic content. And there's our Power Squared email environment variable that we created. So we choose that, and then because it was text, it's just operating in exactly the same manner. It will be replacing this with the text that's inside that environment variable. And we just want to say who it was sent to because that's really important, because if we're changing it, we want to know that it's changed. So this was sent to, and we'll just search for the environment variable because there are sometimes quite a few because you'll have some default ones potentially. Maybe you've installed some solutions. So sometimes you'll need to search for it. And you'll also want to bear in mind that if you've just created the environment variable, maybe it won't show up straight away. Maybe you'll need to refresh your Power Automate flow or wherever you're working. So now we've added those, we click on save, it's saving those. And then once that's saved, we close it, and then it should be good to go. So let's also publish our app. So when we click on publish, it'll automatically save it, give us the option to publish it, and then we're publishing it. And now we have a Power App that has a Power Automate flow where both of them are using environment variables for the things that we want to change when we move environments.
Yeah, that's really, really powerful, isn't it? I just wanted to kind of chip in there actually with if you're editing a flow and you're doing this outside of the Canvas app, there's a little ellipsis of that flow there. That if you click on it, there's a button that says refresh. It's important that you click on that so that the Canvas app can pick up the changes. Otherwise, you might run into an issue where it won't work. So just this little caveat there, if you're doing editing of flows outside of the Canvas app, just to do that, to be on the safe side, you might run into issues otherwise.
That's true. I was actually wondering when I clicked on save and then closed it, if I was going to see it spinning because it should automatically refresh. And I didn't see that happen. So maybe it's a good idea that you mentioned that, and we'll just do a quick refresh and publish again, just in case it didn't actually pull those changes through. But that is the kind of thing that you get with Power Platform quite often, isn't it? Where you just need to double check that you have refreshed what you needed to refresh, you've saved what you needed to save, and finally, we're working with solutions that make sure you publish everything. If it's not published, then it's not pushed itself through to the solution to then be exported.
Yeah. And does that lead us on to publishing the app and the solution then, and showing some of the kind of power of environment variables in action?
Yeah, that sounds great to me. So we're back in our solution. I'll just widen this because we're quite zoomed in, so it minimized it by default. So we've got our solution, Power Squared. Let's go to the overview of it. We're in an unmanaged solution, of course, because we're in development, so we're working on it. We want to be able to customize it. When we move this across to our production environment or our test environment, we don't want our package type to be unmanaged. We don't want people changing things. So that's something to bear in mind. And we're going to talk much more about application lifecycle management and deployments in the future.
And this is where environment variables are really powerful, isn't it? Because I don't think we've kind of touched on this yet, but if we're moving this as a managed solution, aka we can't change anything in it, you can still change the environment variables. This is where the power comes in. You're effectively able to do these changes because of environment variables. So this is why you need to use them if you're not already.
Yeah, that's a great point. The other way, the alternative way of doing this, if we weren't using environment variables, would be very messy, because then maybe we would want to import it as unmanaged so that we can change the code. And then we would need to do this. Oh, it would just get so messy. I can't even imagine that. It hurts me to think about. So we've got our solution here, so we can export it. So I'll just click on export at the top. You've got the option to publish. Just as a general thing, I always publish it just in case there's a chance that something hasn't been published within the solution itself. So when you're clicking on this button, it's going to look at all of the components and make sure they're all published. So now the solution's published, we can, it says there about pipelines. We'll talk about pipelines another time because pipelines are amazing. But for now, we're just going to do this manually. So we'll click on next. It checks for missing components. There shouldn't be any missing component. Oh, okay. So there's the connection reference. So that's actually a really good point from this perspective, because I hadn't really remembered that. But when we were working in Power Automate, we created a connection to Outlook because we're sending an email. Really, we should have, following best practices, we should have created a connection reference inside of our solution first, and then utilized that connection reference so that then we've got a modular connection that we're using instead of just that direct connection that we were using. So this is telling us we're connecting to Outlook. We need a connection reference for that. Do you want to add it to your solution? If we don't add this, then we're going to get an error when we try and import it in the next environment. So we're going to allow it to add that.
Do as we say, not as we do.
Yeah.
In that case, yeah.
This is for a demo. It's fine. So, of course, as we explained, we're going to export this as managed because we don't want it to be changed in the target environment, although the environment variables can be updated as we then import it, and we'll demonstrate that. So let's export it. Right, so it's exported. So the next task for us is to click on download, and then it's just going to throw it into my downloads. So now what we're going to do is we're in the Charlie dev environment. So I've done my development work on this solution, and I've now exported it, and I want to import it into my next environment. So I've got this open already here. You can see in the top right-hand corner there, we've got management. So this is my management environment where I want to import my solution. So I go to import solution, I browse for the file, I've got it in my downloads here, and then I click on next, and then it processes that zip file that we've just provided to it. So it will upload it, it will look inside the zip file, and then it will determine what is going on with it, essentially. So it looks at basically the metadata for that. So it's telling us what the name is, what the publisher is, that it's managed, what the version is, and whether it's a patch or not. And we don't really need to worry about that for now. So we click on next, then it's going to look at the connections. So there are some connections that we need in this environment, and we're importing it fresh, so those connections might not be there, but we can see that, yeah, we've already got those connections. We're good to go. So we'll move on to the next bit. Now it gets very interesting because we've got this thing here called environment variables, which is what we've been talking about. So Josh, you want to talk a little bit about what we're doing here?
Yeah, so hopefully if you're watching this, you've kind of starting to kind of understand the kind of process here, and what's happened and what's happening is, as we've imported the solution, it's picked up that those variables that we used in dev need to be set, right? Because there's no values here at the minute. It's a fresh import. So it's now asking us, well, what's the SharePoint site you want to connect to? What's the SharePoint list you want to connect to? And you might be thinking, well, I'll connect to the same one, but that's not the point here. The point here is we're going into our test or our prod environment. We'll set our SharePoint list and site accordingly so that we've got that segregation of data that's mitigating risk and ensuring quality as well. So as you can see there, we've set it back to power squared. Our list, though, you can see there we've got one called test, not dev, test. We'll set it to test. And for our email, we can set that to self. Click import.
All right, so our solution is imported successfully, so that's great. We've not got any errors. So now what we're looking at on the screen here is unmanaged solution. So we have to make sure not to get confused. We need to click on managed because we've imported it as a managed solution. So here is our solution. We can click into it. And now this is a managed solution. It's telling us you cannot directly edit the objects, which is really important. And it offers you some security towards making sure that your solution doesn't get kind of, I suppose, damaged is the way that I look at it, but essentially that it doesn't get customized and then cause issues with you then when you next try to deploy your solution after you've made some changes, because they might get blocked. So let's have a look then, shall we? So we've got our Canvas app here. Let's play it. So now what we're expecting to see is that it's using a different data source. Of course, the first time it pops up, it's saying, do you want to allow it to have access to the data in those two different connections or connectors? So there's the app loaded, and you can see that we're now accessing a different data source. So this is how we've then used environment variables, where in our previous environment, so where we were developing it, I can open that and show the difference just to show that there is a difference. So this is our development version. And within here, we have, it's a developer environment as well. We have our two records because we're talking to our development version list. And then in our new environment, we've got three records because we're talking to that test list. And so we've talked about development and test. And then, of course, you take it beyond that to production. You can have however many environments suits your needs for this. It could just be development and production, or it could be more. But we'll talk more about deployments and pipelines and things like that in the future so that you don't have to go through this manual process of moving your solutions across. But this shows you how environment variables work. So the other thing that we did was we were sending an email and it was going to me as the developer. Now, if I click on send the email, what it should be doing is using that environment variable, and we set the value to you, Josh, didn't we?
We did, yeah.
Have you got an email?
I have. And let me share my screen so that we are not trying to make it seem like something it isn't. So if I share that, hopefully that is visible.
Perfect.
And you can see that an email has been sent to me. And you can see that environment variable that would set to my email is set there. So that's the power of the environment variable there taking over and doing what it needs to do. So I think that's really cool.
It's fantastic. So the last thing that I wanted to show was what happens if you've set the environment variable when you've imported it, but you're not happy with the environment variable that you set. You want to change it. So Josh, do you have to re-import it again?
No, and this is the powerful thing. If you weren't using environment variables, you'd have to do an import every single time. And that's a really onerous process. But we're using environment variables. We just change the variable in the solution, right? It's really straightforward. However, if you try and change it here, it's not going to let you.
I can't, Josh.
This is a managed solution, and we can't change things in managed solutions. But there is another way. If we go into the default solution.
So if I scroll down, I'm still looking at unmanaged here.
Unmanaged, default solution.
There's a lot in here, Josh.
Loads in here, but don't let that overwhelm you. Go into environment variables on the left. and just search for that variable that we've called. So let's search for the ones that we'd set, and oh, look, there they are. So now we can just go and change that. So why not? If you search for the email variable, you should hopefully see Power Squared email. And actually, we've realized that we don't need to send it to me. We need to send it back to you, Charles. So let's just change that. And this lets us change it here. It's going to update it in our solution as well. It does feel a little bit kind of workaroundy and hacky, but it does work. And it's really good to kind of help with things like testing. So a really good way to kind of speed up that process. So if you want to send that email again,
So, Josh, something
hopefully,
that I think is quite interesting here is if we click on this, we've just changed the environment variable, but do we need to refresh the app? So if we've got hundreds of users on our app, do we need to tell them to refresh or force them to refresh? But we don't.
just updates it straight away. Yeah, that's really interesting. And
Yeah.
I mean, good practice would suggest that you would refresh the app anyway, but it's good to know that you don't have to.
Yeah. So if you've got your users who are currently leaving their apps open in their browsers for eternity, you know that it's going to be okay if you change that environment variable.
Yeah, that's really awesome, actually. And you can see the power of environment variables. I think as a closing comment from me, the power in this is the fact that we're creating these dynamic values that we can change as we move through our environments. But there are still a lot of steps involved here, isn't there? I think as you go through, you can kind of tell that there's lots of clicking, lots of kind of manual input to get this to where you need to get it. But you can automate this, and that is the next step, which we will get into in a future video, is how do you automate this so that as part of your kind of process of importing apps, it's already done and dusted for you. Because when you're dealing with multiple apps, multiple solutions, a large scale, that isn't going to scale like that, but it will scale with an automated approach.
That's really exciting. I'm looking forward to that one. I love any time that you can automate something. So that's like,
Absolutely.
it's my happy place.
Same. So I think that is us today. So thank you for tuning in. Hopefully this has been useful, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thank you.